blood splattered across immaculate marble floors, usually sending nurses fleeing into the freezing Adirondack night. 32 professionals had quit in terror. None lasted longer than 6 days with the reclusive billionaire Cassius Ford. They were all fragile, easily intimidated, and hopelessly enchanted by his terrifying presence. Then came Penelope Ruston, carrying 280 pounds of pure Brooklyn grit and zero tolerance for billionaire temper tantrums. She walked into the monster's lair and refused to leave. Penelope Ruston was not easily intimidated. You couldn't be when you stood 5'4", weighed 280 pounds, and spent the last 6 years running the night shift in the trauma ward at Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. She had wrestled combative patients high on synthetic drugs, stared down furious surgeons with god complexes, and functioned on 3 hours of sleep and stale vending machine coffee for days on end. She knew exactly what she was capable of, even if the world consistently looked at her thick waist and heavy thighs and assumed she was slow. But Penelope, penny to the few people she actually liked, was currently facing an entirely different kind of monster: medical debt. Her younger brother Liam had been diagnosed with an aggressive, atypical variant of ALS. The only treatment that offered any real hope was a highly experimental stem cell therapy trial at Johns Hopkins. The price tag was a staggering $400,000, and insurance refused to cover a dime. Penny had sold her car, emptied her meager 401k, and maxed out 5 credit cards. But she was still short. Desperation had a distinct metallic taste, and she swallowed it every single morning. That was why she was sitting in a plush mahogany-paneled office in the headquarters of Caldwell Elite Care, a hyper-exclusive private nursing agency in Manhattan that catered solely to the ultra-wealthy. "The client is incredibly demanding, Ms. Ruston," said Winston Gable, the impeccably dressed estate manager who had come down to the city specifically to interview her. He had a pinched, aristocratic face, and a gaze that kept discreetly sliding over Penny's broad shoulders and the strain of her sensible navy blue cardigan. "We require someone with utmost discretion, physical stamina, and an unwavering obedience to protocol. The last nurse lasted 4 days." "I did a 5-year stint in an inner-city ER, Mr. Gable," Penny replied, her voice smooth and devoid of the nervous flutter he'd likely expected. She crossed her thick legs, adjusting her skirt with practiced dignity. "I've had patients throw bedpans at my head and threaten my life over a turkey sandwich. I don't scare. What is the diagnosis?" Gable cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Cassius Ford suffers from a severe, highly sensitive hematological condition, a unique variation of porphyria mixed with rapid-onset anemia and behavioral volatility. He requires absolute darkness, severe photosensitivity, and he requires his intravenous nutrition administered at exactly midnight and 3 in the morning. No exceptions. Night shift, fine. Aggressive tendencies? I'm CPR, BLS, and crisis intervention certified. What's the pay?" Gable paused, leaning forward. $50,000 per week. Penny's heart slammed against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite indifference. $50,000 a week. In 2 months, Liam's treatment would be paid in full. She could practically hear the universe screaming that this was a trap, that no legal nursing job paid $200,000 a month. But she didn't care. "I can start tonight," she said. By 10 o'clock that evening, Penny found herself driving a rented sedan up the winding, treacherous roads of the Hudson Valley. A torrential downpour hammered against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep up. Deep in the secluded, heavily forested hills of the Adirondacks, Cold Spring Manor loomed like a nightmare carved from black stone. The estate was massive, a sprawling Gothic mansion surrounded by a 10-foot wrought-iron fence. When she arrived, Gable was waiting in the grand foyer. The interior of the house was freezing, the air heavy with the scent of old dust, beeswax, and copper. There were no bright lights, only dim, yellow-bulbed sconces that cast long, distorted shadows against the silk-paneled walls. "Welcome to Cold Spring, Ms. Ruston," Gable said, taking her wet coat. He looked at her sturdy frame, his lips pursing slightly. "I must warn you again. Mr. Ford is difficult. He does not tolerate failure, and he certainly does not tolerate defiance." "Point me to the medical supply room, Winston," Penny sighed, adjusting the collar of her custom-ordered scrubs. They were tight across her chest and hips. Nursing uniforms were rarely designed for women of her size, but she had learned to move comfortably in them. Gable led her to a state-of-the-art medical suite, hidden behind a heavy oak door on the 2nd floor. "Here are the rules, Ms. Ruston. Listen carefully. Rule number 1, no sunlight or bright artificial light in his chambers, ever. Rule number 2, never look him directly in the eyes for more than 3 seconds. Rule number 3, you bring his nutrition bags exactly on time. You pour them into the silver chalice on his nightstand. You do not ask questions about the nutrition. Do we understand each other?" Penny opened the heavy medical refrigerator. Inside, perfectly arranged, were dozens of unmarked, thick plastic IV bags. She pulled one out. The liquid inside was dark, viscous, and a deep crimson red. She tapped the bag, reading the consistency. "Oh, negative human blood. Clinical vampirism, Penny muttered under her breath, or Renfield's syndrome. It wasn't entirely unheard of in extreme psychiatric cases, though it was incredibly rare. A billionaire suffering from severe delusions, porphyria, and a blood fetish. It explained the darkness, the aggression, and the exorbitant salary. "Excuse me?" Gable asked. "Nothing," Penny said, placing the bag on a steel tray. "Midnight is in 10 minutes. I'll take it from here." Gable looked at her with a mixture of pity and relief. "Godspeed, Ms. Ruston. His quarters are at the end of the West Wing hall. Knock once. Do not wait for an answer." The West Wing was completely devoid of light, save for a few dim, red emergency bulbs running along the baseboards. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees as Penny walked down the corridor, her rubber-soled clogs squeaking softly against the hardwood floor. She carried the silver tray, holding the blood bag, a pair of surgical scissors, and a sterile silver chalice. Her heavy footsteps echoed in the vast, silent space. She wasn't quiet. She had never been a small, delicate thing that moved like a ghost. She was solid, grounded, and unapologetic, taking up space. She reached the massive double doors at the end of the hall. Taking a deep breath, she knocked once. A heavy, booming thud. She didn't wait. She pushed the heavy brass handles and walked in. The master suite was cavernous, shrouded in absolute darkness. Heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight over floor-to-ceiling windows. The only illumination came from the faint moonlight bleeding through a tiny crack in the drapes. "Mr. Ford," Penny called out, her voice calm and authoritative. "It's midnight. Time for your nutrition." Silence. Penny walked toward the massive four-poster bed, squinting in the dark. Suddenly, a violent crash shattered the quiet. A heavy, priceless antique vase smashed against the wall, mere inches from her head, showering her shoulders with porcelain shards. Most women would have screamed. Chloe Adams, the nurse before Penny, had dropped the tray, wet herself, and run screaming into the woods, never to return. Penny didn't even flinch. She slowly blinked, dusted a piece of porcelain off her broad shoulder, and let out a long, deeply exhausted sigh. "That was incredibly childish," she said into the darkness, setting the tray down on a marble table. A low, vibrating growl echoed from the corner of the room. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Cassius Ford was devastatingly beautiful and completely terrifying. He stood over 6'3", broad-shouldered and lean, dressed in a loose black silk shirt that hung open to reveal a pale, heavily scarred chest. His cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass, his hair a mess of raven waves, and his eyes were a glowing, unnatural crimson red. He moved with a speed that defied human physics. In a fraction of a second, he crossed the room and pinned Penny against the heavy oak table, his hands, freezing cold and possessing the strength of industrial steel vices, clamped onto her shoulders. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. He radiated absolute, predatory malice. "You are new," he whispered, his voice a dark, velvety threat that made the air vibrate. "You're not like the fragile little birds they usually send me." Penny looked at him. She didn't look away. Rule 2 explicitly stated not to look him in the eyes. She stared directly into his glowing red irises, noting the slight dilation of his pupils. "And you have terrible bedside manner," Penny replied flatly. Cassius paused, genuinely confused. He pressed harder, trying to shove her backward to assert dominance. But Penelope Ruston was 280 pounds of solid mass with a very low center of gravity. When she planted her feet, she did not move. Cassius pushed, and Penny merely shifted her weight, locking her knees. "What are you?" he hissed, his brow furrowing. He was used to women who weighed half of what he did, women who crumbled like dry leaves when he touched them. "I'm tired, Mr. Ford." "That's what I am," Penny said, firmly grabbing his freezing wrists. She couldn't overpower him. His strength was absurd, but she didn't try to fight. She just peeled his fingers back enough to break his grip, treating him like a stubborn elderly patient who didn't want to take his pills. "Your hands are freezing. You have poor circulation. Sit down on the bed before you faint." Cassius stared at her, utterly bewildered. The sheer audacity of this mortal woman was short-circuiting his ancient brain. He was the vampire king of the eastern seaboard, a 400-year-old apex predator, currently in hiding after a brutal coup by a rival coven. He was recovering from a near-fatal dose of liquid silver that had severely weakened his powers and left him reliant on bagged human blood. He was a monster. He was fear incarnate. "Did you just tell me to sit down?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "Yes, now," Penny snapped, turning her back on him, a cardinal sin in the presence of a predator. She picked up the surgical scissors, snipped the top of the blood bag, and expertly poured the thick red liquid into the silver chalice. She turned back and held it out to him. "Drink your weird protein shake, Cassius. I'm not getting fired because you want to play Dracula in the dark." Cassius did not take the chalice. His pride, older than the nation she was born in, flared into blinding rage. How dare this heavy-footed, insolent human speak to him with such utter disrespect? He stepped closer, drawing himself up to his full, imposing height. He decided to end this charade. If she wouldn't cower physically, he would break her mind. "Look at me, Penelope," Cassius commanded. His voice took on a hypnotic, dual-toned resonance. The ancient power of vampire compulsion flooded the room, an invisible, crushing weight designed to strip away free will and leave a human completely subservient. His crimson eyes flared brighter, spinning with hypnotic allure. "You will kneel, you will beg for my forgiveness, and you will be terrified." Penny looked at him. She stared straight into the glowing, swirling vortexes of his eyes. She felt a strange pressure behind her temples, like the onset of a mild sinus headache. She blinked twice. "I have a bad knee. I'm not kneeling on hardwood floors," she said matter-of-factly, thrusting the chalice closer to his chest. "Take the cup." Cassius recoiled as if she had slapped him. The compulsion had failed, completely. He didn't know if it was because his powers were still weakened from the silver poisoning, or if this woman's mind was simply a fortress of pure, impenetrable pragmatism. In truth, Penny had spent so many years suppressing panic in life-or-death trauma situations that her brain simply classified his supernatural threat as unhelpful stimuli and ignored it. "You," Cassius stammered, a rare crack in his terrifying facade. "You defy me? I am doing my job," Penny said, her patience thinning. She shoved the chalice against his chest. Enraged, Cassius swatted his hand out. He struck the silver chalice, sending it flying across the room. It clattered against the stone fireplace, splashing perfectly good O-negative blood across a priceless, antique Persian rug. Penny's mouth dropped open. She looked at the spilled blood, then slowly looked back at Cassius. The exhaustion of her double shifts, the stress of her brother's illness, and the sheer audacity of this billionaire throwing a tantrum boiled over. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to get biohazardous material out of woven silk?" she yelled. Cassius sneered, baring his teeth. For the first time his fangs descended, long, sharp, and gleaming white in the dim moonlight. He grabbed her thick forearm, his grip bruising. "I will tear your throat out, you insolent cow!" Penny didn't scream. She didn't faint at the sight of the fangs. Instead, instinct took over. She raised her free hand and slapped him. The smack echoed through the massive bedroom like a gunshot. Cassius's head snapped to the side. He froze. In 4 centuries, no human had ever struck him. His fangs were fully extended, his predatory instincts screaming for violence. Without thinking, he whipped his head back and snapped his jaws, grazing his fangs against the underside of her wrist. It wasn't a full bite, it was just a scratch, but a single bead of Penny's blood welled up from the cut and touched Cassius's tongue. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Cassius gasped, stumbling backward and releasing her arm. The taste of her blood hit his system like a localized earthquake. It wasn't just sweet, it was electric. It tasted of life, of pure, unfiltered vitality, rich and complex. He had fed on queens and socialites, on warriors and virgins. But this heavily built, exhausted nurse from Brooklyn possessed blood that sang with an unimaginable power. Instantly, the lingering, agonizing burn of the silver poisoning in his chest began to cool. The agonizing ache in his bones, present for months, vanished just from one drop. He fell to his knees on the ruined Persian rug, staring at her wrist with wide, desperate eyes. The hunger that hit him was no longer just biological. It was addictive. He was a starving man who had just been given a taste of a feast he didn't know existed. Penny looked down at her bleeding wrist, completely unimpressed. She pulled a sterile gauze pad from her deep scrub pocket and pressed it firmly against the scratch. "That's it," she said, her voice shaking slightly, not with fear, but with righteous fury. "If you bite me again, I am calling HR, and I am absolutely demanding a hazard pay premium." She turned around, her thick rubber soles squeaking on the floor, and marched toward the door. "I'm going to get a mop. Don't you dare move." She left the room, the heavy doors slamming behind her. Cassius Ford, the ruthless, terrifying vampire king, remained on his knees in the dark, touching his lips with trembling fingers, completely speechless and craving more. 10 minutes later, Penny marched back into the master suite carrying a yellow plastic mop bucket, a bottle of industrial-grade enzymatic cleaner, and a heavy-duty scrub brush. She kicked the heavy oak doors shut behind her. Cassius Ford had not moved. He was still kneeling on the edge of the ruined Persian rug, his glowing crimson eyes fixed on the door, waiting for her. The terrifying, ancient apex predator looked inexplicably like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Move," Penny ordered, dropping the bucket with a slosh. Cassius blinked, snapping out of his daze. He slowly stood up, towering over her, yet the threatening aura he had projected earlier had entirely evaporated. He watched in bewildered silence as this heavy-set, thoroughly unimpressed mortal woman knelt on the floor, poured a generous splash of cleaner over the bloodstain, and began scrubbing vigorously. "Do you have any idea what you are?" Cassius finally murmured, his voice stripped of its hypnotic compulsion. It was raw, curious, and thrumming with a deep, vibrating tension. "I'm a registered nurse, with a mountain of debt and a severe caffeine addiction," Penny said without looking up, putting her broad shoulders into the scrubbing motion. "And you're a grown man who throws things when he doesn't get his way. Hand me that towel." To his own absolute shock, Cassius reached over to the side table, picked up a folded linen towel, and handed it to her. "My coven," Cassius began, his words slow and measured. "We were ambushed 3 months ago by a rival faction led by a traitor named Alistair Croft. They used liquid silver. It is a poison that corrodes our kind from the inside out. I survived, but my healing factor was destroyed. I have been trapped in this state, weakened, unable to tolerate the sun, unable to digest anything but basic, bagged human blood. It merely keeps me from turning to ash." "Fascinating. Your hematologist must be thrilled," Penny deadpanned, wiping up the pinkish foam. In a blur of motion, Cassius was suddenly kneeling right in front of her. Penny startled, leaning back on her thick thighs. He didn't touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the unnatural cold radiating from his skin. "One drop," Cassius whispered, his gaze dropping to the white gauze on her wrist. "One drop of your blood, Penelope, and the pain in my chest stopped. My cellular regeneration sparked. You are not a standard human. Your blood is a catalyst, a source of pure, unadulterated vitality. I need it." Penny stopped wiping the floor. She looked at his pale, perfectly sculpted face, seeing the desperate edge beneath his aristocratic features. She thought of Liam. She thought of the $400,000 required for the Hopkins trial. She thought of the eviction notices piling up on her kitchen counter in Brooklyn. A slow, deeply pragmatic realization dawned on her. She held all the cards. "You want my blood?" Penny asked, her voice dropping its annoyed edge, replaced by the cool, calculating tone of a woman who negotiated with hospital administrators for a living. "I will pay you double your salary," Cassius offered eagerly, his fangs retracting as he leaned in. "Whatever Winston promised you, I will double it. Just let me drink." "No," Penny said flatly. Cassius froze, his eyes narrowing. "No? I don't care about a weekly salary, Mr. Ford. I need a lump sum. Tomorrow morning, you're going to have Winston wire $450,000 to the Johns Hopkins Experimental Neurology Department under the name Liam Ruston. You will cover his housing, his transport, and a full-time care team." Cassius stared at her. $500,000 for a few pints of blood? "For my blood," Penny corrected, tapping her chest. "The magical, catalytic blood that you just said you desperately need to cure your fancy silver poisoning. That's my price. And if I refuse, if I simply take it by force?" The threat was there, an ancient instinct flaring up. Penny snorted, completely unbothered. She tossed the dirty towel into the bucket. "Then you kill the golden goose, Cassius. You drain me, I die, and you get exactly 1 meal. Or you pay for my brother's life, and I become your personal willing donor. But we do it my way. Your way? Sterile environment, a tourniquet, butterfly needles, and blood bags," Penny stated, ticking the conditions off on her fingers. "I draw it. You drink it from a cup. No fangs, no biting, no weird, creepy bedroom intimacy. I am a medical professional, and we will treat this as a prescribed transfusion. Do we have a deal?" Cassius looked at this woman. She was not delicate. She was round, solid, and utterly immovable. Her curves were lush and heavy, her face flushed with the exertion of scrubbing the floor, and her eyes burned with a fierce protective fire that he had not seen in centuries. She wasn't just offering him a cure, she was offering him a masterclass in defiance. For the first time in 3 months, a genuine, wicked smile curved across the Vampire King's lips. "You drive a brutal bargain, Nurse Ruston," Cassius whispered. "We have a deal." Within 3 weeks, the dynamic inside Cold Spring Manor had shifted so drastically that Winston Gable frequently had to sit down and massage his temples to prevent a migraine. The first massive change was that the $400,000 wire transfer had cleared in 12 hours. Liam was safely admitted to the Hopkins trial, his voice thick with tears of gratitude when he called Penny from his new, state-of-the-art suite. With that crushing weight lifted from her shoulders, Penny thrived. The second change was Cassius. The medical draws happened twice a week. Penny would set up a sterile station in the medical suite, tap a vein in her plump, soft arm, and draw exactly 1 pint of blood. Cassius would sit across from her, his crimson eyes tracking the dark red liquid flowing through the plastic tubing with a predatory hunger he barely kept in check. but it was working. The transformation was miraculous. The sickly pallor of his skin was replaced by a healthy, luminous glow. The veins around his eyes stopped protruding. His unnatural chill faded, replaced by the faint, comforting warmth of a living creature. More surprisingly, he stopped hiding in the dark. One Tuesday afternoon, Penny was in the massive estate kitchen. She was off duty until midnight, wearing comfortable grey sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt, her thick, curly hair thrown up in a messy bun. She was happily assembling a massive triple-decker turkey sandwich with thick slices of cheddar cheese and a heavy dollop of mayonnaise. She turned around, plate in hand, and nearly dropped it. Cassius was standing in the doorway. The heavy UV-blocking blinds were drawn, but the kitchen was fully lit. He was wearing a fitted charcoal sweater that clung to his broad chest and heavily muscled arms. He looked healthy. He looked breathtaking. "You're out of your cave," Penny noted, recovering her composure. She walked past him to the massive mahogany dining table and sat down, her thighs spreading comfortably against the wood of the chair. "I am feeling significantly better," Cassius said, stepping into the kitchen. He moved with a liquid grace, pulling out a chair opposite her. "My tolerance for artificial light has returned, and I found the West Wing suddenly very quiet." Penny took a huge bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "Well, you don't have anyone to throw vases at anymore." Cassius actually chuckled, a deep, rich sound that sent an unexpected shiver down Penny's spine. "I have apologized for the vase, Penelope. You bought me a new stethoscope. That's not an apology, that's a bribe," she retorted, wiping a smear of mayo from her lip. Cassius watched her eat. In his 4 centuries of existence, he had surrounded himself with the elite of high society, women who starved themselves to maintain hollowed-out frames, who spoke in whispers, who floated through ballrooms like fragile apparitions. They were beautiful, but they were empty. Penelope was different. There was a profound, grounding gravity to her. Cassius found his gaze wandering to the soft, heavy curve of her stomach beneath her shirt, the thick, powerful columns of her thighs, the generous swell of her breasts. She was abundant. She was a woman who took up space and demanded the world make room for her. To a creature who fed on life force, she was the most intoxicating thing he had ever seen. "You are staring," Penny pointed out, narrowing her eyes. "I am observing," Cassius corrected, his voice dropping an octave. He leaned his elbows on the table. "You do not apologize for yourself. Most humans I have encountered are terrified of taking up too much room. They shrink. You do not shrink, Penelope." Penny paused. She had spent her whole life enduring backhanded compliments about her weight, doctors telling her to slim down, and men treating her as a punchline. She bristled defensively. "If this is a passive-aggressive comment about my size, Cassius, you can take your aristocratic manners and shove them." "It is reverence," Cassius interrupted, his crimson eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, searing intensity. The air in the kitchen grew heavy. "I have lived in a world of ghosts and shadows for a very long time. You are the first truly real, tangible thing I have touched in centuries. Your strength, your body, it is magnificent." Penny's breath hitched. She stared at him, searching his face for a hint of mockery, but there was none, only a raw, burning sincerity that made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, the heavy kitchen doors burst open. Winston Gable rushed in, his usually immaculate suit rumpled, his face paper-white. "Mr. Ford," Winston gasped, out of breath. "The perimeter alarms. The outer wards on the gate have been breached." Cassius's romantic intensity vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying, cold fury of a warlord. He stood up, the wooden chair splintering slightly under his grip. "Who?" "Mercenaries, armed with silver nitrate rounds. And there are others with them, fast ones. Alistair Croft's hunters have found us. Get into the panic room," Cassius ordered Winston. He turned to Penny, his eyes glowing like hot coals. "Penelope, go with him, now." "I'm not a damsel, Cassius. I can help," Penny argued, standing up. "They will rip you to pieces to get to me," Cassius roared, the sound vibrating the crystal glasses in the cupboards. "Go!" The silence of Cold Spring Manor was shattered by a deafening explosion. The heavy oak front doors of the estate blew inward, sending massive splinters of wood flying across the grand foyer. Penny and Winston were halfway up the grand staircase, making a break for the hidden panic room in the east wing when the first wave of attackers breached. 5 men, clad in tactical black gear, poured into the hall, carrying heavily modified assault rifles. Behind them moved 3 figures that defied human description. Rogue vampires loyal to Alistair Croft, their skin deathly pale, moving with terrifying, jerky speed. "There, the human servants!" one of the mercenaries shouted, raising his rifle. "Get down!" Penny shoved Winston hard, sending the frail estate manager tumbling onto the carpeted landing just as a hail of gunfire chewed through the marble balustrade where they had been standing seconds before. Before the gunmen could adjust their aim, a shadow detached itself from the ceiling. Cassius hit the floor like a meteor. He didn't use weapons. He didn't need them. Fully restored by weeks of Penny's blood, the Vampire King unleashed 400 years of repressed, brutal fury. He moved faster than the human eye could track. He caught the first mercenary by the throat, snapping his neck with a sickening crunch, and hurled the body into two others like a bowling ball. Penny crouched behind the staircase, her heart hammering against her ribs, watching in horrified awe. This was the monster Winston had warned her about. Cassius was a blur of violence, his claws extended, tearing through tactical armor as if it were wet tissue paper. "Winston, are you hit?" Penny demanded, going into automatic triage mode. Winston was clutching his thigh, blood seeping through his grey trousers. "A graze," he wheezed. "Ms. Ruston, we must keep moving." Down below, the three rogue vampires hissed, drawing short, wickedly curved blades gleaming with an iridescent sheen, liquid silver. They flanked Cassius, coordinating their strikes. Cassius easily parried the first two, disemboweling one with a brutal swipe of his hand, but the third rogue slipped past his guard. The silver blade plunged deep into Cassius's side, sliding between his ribs. A horrific, inhuman roar of agony tore from Cassius's throat. The sound chilled Penny to the bone. Smoke began to pour from the wound, as the silver immediately began burning his internal organs. Cassius grabbed the rogue's head and crushed his skull, but the damage was done. He pulled the blade from his side, tossing it away, but he stumbled, dropping to one knee. "Cassius!" Penny screamed. The remaining mercenary, seeing the Vampire King fall, swung his rifle up, aiming directly at Cassius's head. Penny didn't think. She didn't weigh the odds. She reached into the deep pocket of her medical scrubs, pulling out an emergency syringe she always kept on her person for combative, drug-induced patients in the ER. A massive dose of Haldol and Ativan. It wouldn't kill a vampire, but it would drop a human like a stone. She vaulted over the shattered balustrade, her heavy frame sliding down the marble stairs with surprising agility. She hit the ground running. The mercenary heard her heavy footsteps and turned, his eyes widening as 280 pounds of furious Brooklyn nurse barreled toward him. Penny didn't stop. She hit him with the full force of her body like a defensive lineman, knocking the breath out of him and sending his rifle skittering across the floor. As they crashed to the marble, Penny pinned him down with her knees, grabbed him by the collar, and jammed the syringe directly into his neck, pushing the plunger down with her thumb. The mercenary thrashed wildly for 3 seconds before his eyes rolled back, and he went completely limp. Penny scrambled off him, breathing heavily, and rushed to Cassius. The Vampire King was slumped against the wall, clutching his side. The veins in his neck were turning black, the silver poisoning spreading rapidly through his system. He looked up at her, his crimson eyes dimming. "I told you to run," he gasped, his voice wet with blood. "Shut up! I'm working!" Penny snapped, ripping open his ruined sweater. The wound was horrific, bubbling and smoking. "The silver is in your bloodstream. Your cellular regeneration is crashing." "I am done for, Penelope," Cassius whispered, his head lolling back against the wall. "Alistair has won." "Not on my shift," Penny growled. She looked around. The medical suite was upstairs, and he was too heavy to carry. Bagged blood wouldn't act fast enough to counter a direct silver injection. He needed a massive, direct surge of vitality. He needed it raw, and he needed it now. Penny rolled up the sleeve of her scrub top, exposing her thick, soft forearm. She pressed it directly against Cassius's mouth. "Drink," she ordered. Cassius weakly pushed her arm away. "No, the frenzy. I will not be able to stop. I will drain you." "Cassius Ford, look at me," Penny commanded, grabbing his jaw with her bloody hands and forcing him to meet her eyes. Her gaze was fierce, unyielding, and completely devoid of fear. "I am a thick, stubborn woman with enough blood volume to keep an elephant alive. I told you I make the rules. Rule number 4, you do not die on me. Now bite me." Cassius let out a shuddering breath. His survival instincts, fueled by the intoxicating scent of her pulse, finally overrode his restraint. His fangs extended. With a desperate groan, he grabbed her thick forearm, pulling her flush against his chest, and sank his teeth deep into her flesh. Penny gasped, her back arching as a sharp, intense pain flared through her arm. But it was quickly followed by a strange euphoric rush, a side effect of the vampire venom meant to soothe prey. She slumped against him, her heavy body pressing into his, grounding him. The effect was instantaneous. As Penny's rich, heavy blood flooded his system, the black veins on Cassius's neck began to recede. The smoking wound on his side hissed, the healthy tissue aggressively regenerating, and pushing the microscopic silver particles out of his body. Cassius drank deeply, his hands moving from her arm to grip the thick, soft curves of her hips, anchoring himself to her as if she were the only real thing in a crumbling universe. He felt her heartbeat, steady and strong like a war drum, syncing with his own dead heart, forcing it to beat again. He pulled back, gasping for air, his eyes blazing with a renewed, terrifying light. The wound on his side had completely closed. He looked down at Penny, who was pale and sweating but still conscious, leaning heavily against his chest. "Are we good?" Penny mumbled, feeling slightly lightheaded, reaching into her pocket to pull out a gauze pad to press against the bite marks. Cassius looked at this incredible woman. She had broken his rules, challenged his authority, demanded $500,000, and had just body-slammed a mercenary to save his life. Gently, effortlessly, Cassius scooped her up into his arms, cradling her solid weight against his chest, as if she weighed nothing at all. He looked down at her, a profound, unshakable devotion cementing in his ancient soul. "We are perfect," Cassius whispered, pressing a kiss to her sweaty forehead. "But Alistair Croft has just made a fatal mistake. He threatened what is mine." The panic room in the East Wing was not a dark, damp dungeon. It was a brightly lit, sterile bunker, equipped with reinforced steel walls, a bank of security monitors, and a fully stocked trauma bay. Cassius laid Penny gently on the examination table, his hands lingering on her waist, just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Penny groaned, rubbing her face. The room was spinning slightly. Drawing a full pint of blood from a vein was one thing. Having a vampire aggressively feed directly from an artery was entirely different. Her body felt heavy, lethargic, yet strangely electrified by the lingering venom. "Don't move," Cassius commanded, his voice tight with an emotion he hadn't felt in centuries, panic. He turned to the medical cabinets, his hands tearing through boxes of supplies with frantic, uncoordinated speed. "Where is the saline? The iron supplements? Winston, get in here." Winston limped through the reinforced door, leaning heavily on a cane he had pulled from the hallway. He looked pale but alive. "Cassius, stop," Penny said, her voice raspy. She pushed herself up on her elbows. "You're going to wreck my supply closet. Bottom drawer on the left, Winston. Grab a juice box. And a cookie. I need sugar, not a blood transfusion." Cassius froze, staring at her in disbelief. "You just lost a dangerous amount of blood. You were nearly unconscious." "I work 12-hour shifts on my feet without a bathroom break, Cassius. I've survived worse," Penny muttered, accepting a small carton of apple juice from Winston. She stabbed the tiny straw into the foil with practiced precision and took a long sip. The sugar hit her system, clearing the fog from her brain. She looked down at the thick gauze pad secured to her forearm, then looked up at the towering vampire. "So, Alistair Croft." Cassius's jaw clenched. The mention of the name brought the ancient predatory coldness back into his eyes. "He was my lieutenant, my second in command for over a century. When the modern world shifted, when humanity began tracking digital footprints and regulating the medical industry, I ordered our covens to adapt. We moved into the shadows. We invested in private medical corporations to secure our blood supply quietly. Alistair believed we were becoming domesticated. He wanted to return to the old ways, hunting in the streets, taking what we wanted. A traditionalist," Penny noted, finishing the juice and tossing the empty box into a biohazard bin. "And a dramatic one, judging by the mercenaries he sent to shoot up your foyer." "He believes I'm dead," Cassius explained, pacing the length of the bunker. His movements were fluid, crackling with restored energy. "He used the attack tonight to confirm it. Those mercenaries were meant to clear the estate, to ensure my ashes were scattered. Now, he will move to consolidate power. He will claim the title of king." "How?" Penny asked, her practical mind immediately looking for the logistics of the problem. "Does he just put on a crown and declare himself the winner? Is there a vampire voting system?" "No," Cassius said, stopping at the foot of her bed. "There is the Blood Gala. It is an ancient rite. Tomorrow night, Alistair will host the leaders of the 5 major North American covens in Manhattan. He will provide a feast, the purest, most exclusive blood vintages. By drinking from his chalice, the coven leaders swear fealty to him. Once they drink, his rule is absolute. To challenge him after that would mean war against all 5 covens." Penny swung her thick legs over the side of the examination table. She tested her weight, finding her balance solid. "So you crash the party. You walk in, prove you aren't Ash, and punch him in the face." "It is not that simple," Winston interjected softly, leaning against the counter. "Alistair controls the supply chain now. He has taken over the shell companies we use to source our sustenance quietly. The coven leaders will follow whoever can guarantee their survival in the modern era. Alistair holds the keys to the food supply. Cassius walking in there without leverage will only result in his immediate execution." Penny frowned. She crossed her arms over her chest, the fabric of her scrub top pulling tight across her broad shoulders. She looked at the bank of security monitors, then at Winston, and finally at at Cassius. A slow, calculating spark ignited in her eyes. "Winston," Penny said, her voice sharp with sudden authority. "These shell companies, what are they?" "Mostly private plasma donation centers, boutique blood banks catering to concierge doctors, and a few medical logistics firms," Winston replied, confused by her sudden intensity. "And how are they managed?" Penny pressed. "Are they centralized? Do they use a digital inventory tracking system like Epic or Cerner?" Cassius looked at her, his head tilting slightly. "They use a proprietary database. Alistair's human thralls manage the logistics." "Why?" Penny let out a deep, booming laugh. It wasn't a delicate giggle. It was the robust, cynical laugh of a woman who had spent years fighting hospital administration. "You guys are ancient, immortal apex predators, but you know absolutely nothing about modern healthcare logistics," Penny said, shaking her head. "You don't need a sword to take down Alistair. You need an administrator." She walked over to the computer terminal in the corner of the room, her heavy clogs thudding against the metal floor. "When I was head nurse at Mount Sinai, I ran the inventory protocols for the entire hematology department. I know exactly how these systems work. If Alistair's supply chain is run through standard medical databases, it has vulnerabilities, human error, regulatory compliance loopholes. Winston, I need you to log into whatever backdoor access you still have to those companies." Winston limped over to the terminal, typing rapidly. "I have read-only access left, Ms. Ruston. They locked me out of the executive controls." "I don't need executive controls. I just need the shipping manifests for tomorrow night," Penny said, leaning over his shoulder. She pointed a thick finger at the screen. "There, the Manhattan Gala. Look at the delivery route. They are sourcing the special vintage from a private blood bank in the Upper East Side. It's being transported via medical courier at 6 p.m. tomorrow." Cassius moved to stand beside her. The warmth radiating from her body was intoxicating, but he forced himself to focus on the screen. "What are you suggesting, Penelope?" "I'm suggesting we ruin his catering," Penny said, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "Alistair wants to prove he can feed the 5 covens. We are going to ensure that when they drink from his cup, they get a very rude awakening. I need access to the estate's chemical supply, and I need a dress. If we're crashing a gala, I refuse to do it in bloody scrubs." Cassius stared at the heavy-set, commanding woman beside him. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense. She wielded no magic, possessed no supernatural speed. Yet as she stood there, orchestrating the downfall of a 400-year-old vampire coup, using delivery manifests and medical sabotage, Cassius realized he had never seen a more terrifying, magnificent creature in his entire existence. "Winston," Cassius said, his voice rumbling with dark, absolute conviction. "Get the head of our private design house on the phone immediately. Tell them to clear their schedule. The Queen requires a gown." The penthouse suite of the Plaza Hotel had been entirely rented out by a mysterious corporate entity. Inside, a team of tailors fluttered around Penny like frantic birds. She stood on a circular pedestal in front of a massive gilded mirror. For the past 3 hours, they had been measuring, cutting, and pinning a gown that Cassius had commissioned with an unlimited budget. Penny looked at her reflection. She had always made peace with her body. She knew she was fat, she knew she was solid, and she had never wasted her energy trying to shrink herself to fit into a world that demanded smallness. But looking in the mirror now, she felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The dress was a masterpiece of deep, blood-red velvet. It did not try to hide her size, it celebrated it. The bodice was structured, corseted tightly to support the heavy, lush swell of her breasts, leaving her shoulders bare. The fabric draped elegantly over her thick waist and flared out over her wide hips, creating a dramatic, sweeping silhouette that pooled like liquid fire around her feet. The color was identical to the crimson of Cassius's eyes. She looked like royalty. She looked dangerous. The heavy mahogany doors of the suite clicked open, and Cassius stepped inside. The tailors instantly stepped back, intimidated by the sheer imposing presence of the billionaire. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight black tuxedo, a subtle dark red pocket square the only flash of color. Cassius stopped dead in his tracks. His crimson eyes swept over Penny, and the ancient, terrifying vampire king looked genuinely struck dumb. He crossed the room slowly, waving a hand to dismiss the tailors. They scrambled out of the room, closing the doors quietly behind them. "You," Cassius murmured, stopping at the edge of the pedestal. He looked up at her, his gaze burning with a heat that made Penny's skin flush. "You are a revelation." "It's a good dress," Penny said, trying to maintain her practical demeanor, though her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "It is not the dress," Cassius replied softly. He reached up, his cool, strong hands wrapping around her thick waist. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to span it with his hands as if she were fragile. He gripped her firmly, pulling her to the edge of the pedestal so she was looking down at him. "It is the woman wearing it. You carry power, Penelope. You wear it like armor." He leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the bare skin of her shoulder. A shiver racked Penny's spine. For a moment, the war, the impending gala, and the danger faded away, leaving only the magnetic pull between them. "Cassius," Penny whispered, her voice breathless. "Tonight, you stay close to me," he commanded, looking up into her eyes. "You execute your sabotage, and then you stay behind me. I will not let Alistair or anyone else touch you. Do you understand?" "I can take care of myself," Penny reminded him, though she didn't pull away from his grip. "I know," Cassius smiled, a predatory gleam returning to his eyes. "That is precisely what makes you so intoxicating. Come, let us go ruin a king." The Blood Gala was being held at an exclusive underground ballroom beneath a defunct Gothic cathedral in the financial district. The architecture was breathtaking. Vaulted stone ceilings, massive chandeliers dripping with black crystals, and shadows that seemed to dance against the walls. The room was filled with the elite of the vampire world. Men and women dressed in haute couture, moving with predatory grace, speaking in hushed ancient dialects. In the center of the room, standing on a raised dais, was Alistair Croft. He was a slender, sharp-featured man with pale blonde hair and cold, calculating blue eyes. He radiated smug satisfaction, holding a massive, jewel-encrusted silver chalice. Cassius and Penny entered through a side passage, cloaked in the shadows. The plan was simple, yet incredibly dangerous. "The catering prep room is behind the altar," Cassius whispered, his breath brushing Penny's ear. He handed her a small security keycard Winston had procured. "You have 5 minutes before they bring the grand vintage out. I will draw their attention. Do it quickly." Penny nodded. She reached into the slit of her velvet dress, feeling the comforting weight of the large industrial syringe strapped to her thick thigh. Inside the syringe was a custom cocktail she had mixed in the Cold Spring lab, a massive dose of deferoxamine, a chemical chelata used to treat iron toxicity in humans, mixed with highly concentrated animal tranquilizers. For a human, it would cause severe anemia and drowsiness. For a vampire, who relied entirely on the rapid synthesis of iron in fresh blood to maintain their power, it would be crippling. She slipped away from Cassius, moving with surprising stealth for a woman of her size. Her soft-soled heels made no sound against the stone floor. She bypassed 2 guards entirely, slipping through a heavy velvet curtain into the prep room. The room was cold, lined with steel medical refrigerators. On a central table sat a massive, ornate crystal decanter filled with thick, dark blood. This was the grand vintage, the blood of a rare super donor reserved specifically for the coven leaders to seal their oath to Alistair. Penny approached the table. She pulled the syringe from her thigh, removed the cap with her teeth, and plunged the thick needle into the rubber stopper of the decanter's base. She pushed the plunger down, injecting the entire cocktail into the blood. She swirled the decanter gently, watching the clear liquid seamlessly mix with the crimson. "Hey, what are you doing in here?" Penny spun around. A vampire guard, dressed in a sleek black suit, stood in the doorway. His fangs were bared, his eyes flashing with anger. He lunged at her. Penny didn't scream. She grabbed a heavy, solid silver serving tray from the table and swung it with all of her 280 pounds of momentum. Clang! The edge of the heavy silver tray caught the vampire squarely in the jaw. The impact of the silver burned him instantly, and the sheer blunt force trauma sent him crashing backward into a stack of champagne flutes. He went down hard, knocked completely unconscious. Penny stepped over him, straightened her velvet dress, and walked out the door just as the ceremonial music began to play in the main ballroom. She emerged from the shadows just as Alistair Croft raised his hands, silencing the crowd. "Brothers and sisters of the night," Alistair's voice echoed through the cavernous space, smooth and dripping with arrogance. "For too long we have hidden. For too long we have allowed the weak to dictate our survival. Cassius Ford is ash on the wind. The old regime is dead. I offer you a new era. Drink with me and pledge your loyalty to the new king." Servants moved through the crowd, pouring the dark, spiked blood from the crystal decanter into the goblets of the 5 coven leaders. Alistair held his own chalice high. "To the new era!" Alistair cried, bringing the chalice to his lips. The coven leaders drank deep. Penny stood by the massive stone pillars at the edge of the room, her heart hammering, counting down the seconds in her head. 3, 2, 1... Alistair suddenly gasped. The silver chalice slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the stone floor. He gripped his throat, his blue eyes widening in absolute terror. Around the dais, the 5 coven leaders collapsed to their knees. They weren't dying, but they were completely paralyzed, gasping for air as the chemical chelata rapidly stripped the iron from their systems, neutralizing their supernatural strength in seconds. What is this?" Alistair choked, stumbling backward, his skin turning a sickly, ash grey. He looked at his hands, which were trembling violently. His power was gone. He felt heavy, sluggish, mortal. "Poison! We have been poisoned!" Panic erupted in the ballroom. The elite vampires hissed, backing away from the dais. And then, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom blew open with a concussive blast of sheer force. The room went dead silent. Cassius Ford stepped through the smoke and splintered wood. He did not look like a businessman tonight. He looked like the ancient warlord who had conquered the eastern seaboard. His eyes blazed with a terrifying, luminescent crimson. The dark aura radiating from him was so oppressive that the vampires in the room were physically forced to their knees. "Hello, Alistair," Cassius said, his voice a low, vibrating purr that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I hear you have been trying on my crown. I think it is time you give it back." Alistair stared at Cassius in sheer disbelief, his heavily compromised body refusing to obey his commands to run. You were injected with liquid silver. I saw the reports. You should be dead." "I found an excellent nurse," Cassius replied coldly, walking slowly down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him, terrified. Alistair's loyal guards, unaffected by the spiked blood, roared and charged at Cassius from the flanks. There were 6 of them, armed with silver blades. Cassius didn't even break his stride. He moved with a speed that blurred reality. He caught the wrist of the first guard, twisting it until the bone shattered, and drove the guard's own silver blade into his chest. He spun, catching the second by the throat, and hurling him across the room into a stone pillar with enough force to crack the masonry. It was a massacre, elegant and brutal. Within 30 seconds, all 6 guards were broken on the floor. Alistair, desperate and terrified, realized he could not fight Cassius. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. That was when he saw her, standing by the pillars, wearing the deep red velvet gown that matched Cassius's eyes, was a human, the heavy-set woman who had slipped out of the catering room. With a burst of adrenaline fueled by pure panic, Alistair lunged toward Penny. He might be weakened by the chemicals, but he was still a vampire. He closed the distance in a second, grabbing Penny by her thick hair and yanking her backward against his chest. He pressed a wicked, jagged silver dagger against her throat. "Stop!" Alistair screamed, his voice cracking. Cassius froze instantly. The terrifying aura around him spiked, his fangs fully extending, a low, guttural growl ripping from his chest. "Let her go, Alistair. If you break her skin, I will spend the next century peeling yours off piece by piece." "She poisoned the blood," Alistair hissed, his grip tightening on Penny's hair. "I'll cut her throat right now. Back away, Cassius." Penny did not panic. She felt the cold edge of the silver blade pressing against her collarbone. She felt Alistair's chest heaving behind her. He was weak, his grip was trembling. The drugs were working. He just didn't realize how much leverage he had lost. "Hey, Alistair," Penny said calmly, her voice echoing in the silent room. "Shut up, human," he barked. "I just wanted to let you know," Penny continued, her tone conversational. "I work in the trauma ward. We deal with hostage situations with meth addicts all the time. You always check the hands." Before Alistair could process her words, Penny moved. She didn't try to pull away from the knife. Instead, she stomped her heavy, solid heel directly onto Alistair's instep with bone-crushing force. Alistair cried out in pain, his grip on her hair loosening for a fraction of a second. That was all Penny needed. She spun her heavy frame with brutal momentum, throwing her elbow directly into his ribs. As he doubled over, coughing, Penny brought her right hand up. Clasped tightly in her fist was a surgical scalpel, forged entirely of medical-grade silver, a souvenir she had slipped from the Cold Spring medical suite. She drove the silver scalpel directly into Alistair's shoulder, burying it to the hilt. Alistair let out an agonizing, ear-piercing scream as the silver immediately began burning his flesh. He dropped the dagger and fell backward, writhing on the floor. Penny took a step back, breathing heavily, the red velvet of her dress swirling around her thick legs. She looked down at the traitorous vampire, completely unfazed. "Discharged against medical advice," she muttered. Cassius was there in a heartbeat. He didn't look at Alistair. His hands were on Penny, cupping her face, checking her throat for a cut. His glowing eyes scanned every inch of her. "I'm fine, Cassius," Penny said, catching his hands. "I'm perfectly fine." Cassius let out a breath he didn't need, the tension draining from his massive shoulders. He turned his attention to Alistair, who was still screaming on the floor. Cassius reached down, grabbing Alistair by the throat, and lifted him completely off the ground with one hand. Cassius looked out over the ballroom. The 5 Coven leaders were still on their knees, slowly recovering from the chemical block, watching in absolute terror. "Hear me!" Cassius's voice boomed, resonating with ancient, undisputed authority. "The coup is broken. The supply chains are mine. The throne is mine. Anyone who questions my rule will meet the same fate as this traitor. Do you understand?" The Coven leaders, coughing and trembling, bowed their heads in unison. "Yes, King Cassius." Cassius turned his gaze back to Alistair. There was no hesitation. With a brutal, sickening twist of his wrist, Cassius snapped Alistair Croft's neck. He tossed the lifeless body to the floor like discarded trash. The war was over. Hours later, the rain had returned to the Adirondacks, washing over the black stone of Cold Spring Manor. Penny was back in the master suite. The ruined Persian rug had been replaced, the shattered vase cleared away. She was standing by the massive window, looking out into the dark forest. She had finally taken off the heavy velvet gown and was dressed in her comfortable, oversized grey sweatpants and a worn-out t-shirt. She felt exhausted, but the crushing weight of her brother's medical debt was gone, and the adrenaline of the night was slowly fading into a deep, profound peace. The heavy doors opened quietly. Cassius stepped in. He had shed his tuxedo jacket and unbuttoned his shirt. Looking beautifully disheveled, he walked across the room and wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her solid, warm body flush against his back. He buried his face in her thick, curly hair, inhaling deeply. "The Covens have fallen in line," Cassius murmured against her neck. "Winston has secured the logistics companies. You have saved my empire, Penelope." "I saved your life," Penny corrected him softly, leaning back into his embrace, her hands resting over his cool forearms. "The empire is just a bonus." Cassius turned her gently around so she was facing him. He looked down at her wide hips, her thick waist, her beautiful, defiant face. He didn't see a human servant. He didn't see a blood donor. He saw his equal. "You know I cannot let you go back to the hospital, Penelope," Cassius said, his voice dropping to a dark, possessive purr. "You belong here, with me." Penny raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms over her chest, letting her natural authority flare up. "Excuse me? I am a registered nurse. I don't belong anywhere I don't want to be, and I certainly don't take orders from overgrown bats." Cassius smiled, a genuine radiant expression that made him look breathtaking. "I am not giving an order, Penelope. I am begging." He slowly dropped to one knee on the hardwood floor. He took her plump, soft hand in his, pressing his lips to her knuckles. "I have lived in darkness for centuries. You are the only light I can tolerate. You are the strongest, most magnificent creature I have ever encountered. Rule beside me, be my queen, dictate the logistics, command the covens, and let me worship you for the rest of your natural life, and beyond if you ever choose to join me in eternity." Penny looked down at the terrifying vampire king kneeling at her feet. She thought about her cramped apartment in Brooklyn. She thought about the grueling double shifts, the disrespect, the endless struggle to survive in a world that constantly told her she was too big, too loud, too much. Here, in the dark, she was exactly enough. She was everything. Penny smiled, a slow, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. She tugged on his hand, forcing him to stand up. "I'll stay," Penny said softly, "but I have conditions. Winston gets a raise, Liam comes to visit whenever he wants, and I am entirely reorganizing your blood supply chain. The inventory system is a mess." Cassius laughed, sweeping her up into his arms, burying his face in the soft crook of her neck. "Whatever you desire, my queen, the world is yours." As he carried her toward the massive four-poster bed, Penelope Ruston finally let herself relax. She had walked into a monster's lair, broken every rule, and somehow the monster had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with her. And that's how a tough, unapologetic Brooklyn nurse outsmarted a vampire rebellion, fixed an ancient blood supply chain, and claimed the heart of a 400-year-old billionaire king. Penny proved that true strength and true beauty doesn't fit into a tiny box. She took up space, demanded respect, and won it all. If you loved watching Penny break all the rules and claim her throne, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who loves a fiercely pragmatic, curvy heroine who doesn't back down, and subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, twist-filled romance sagas.